Welcome to European Journeys. This is the very first stage of a new series that takes us to Sweden and where we will look at how Sweden was Christianized. And the very first place we are going to visit is called Gamla Uppsala. Gamla means old, and so it's Old Uppsala. And of course, you may know the main city, Uppsala, and we are in fact only 5 kilometers away from the city center of the modern city of Uppsala. But Gamla Uppsala nowadays is pretty much something like a vast open field, except for a few mounds that we can find there near the medieval church, therefore in those fields. And of course they are very visible because of the fact that the land is flat. These mounds are not natural, they are in fact man-made. And these mounds are pointers to how Sweden could look like, or how Sweden was before the arrival of Christianity. And even the word Uppsala itself points also back to the pre-Christian times of Sweden. So as you may have understood, what we are going to do today is to explore a little bit how Sweden would have looked like before the arrival of Christianity. If we want to understand how Christianity influences Sweden, we have to understand how Sweden would look like before the arrival of Christianity. The word Uppsala itself, as I said, points back to the pagan times because the ending Sala probably comes from the Old Norse Sal, which means simply a big hall, a banqueting hall. Because in fact, in ancient times, the banqueting hall was a place where the king gathered his subjects and where somehow a meal was done in order to mark the fact that the king was sovereign over them. It was a sort of oath, basically, taken between the king and the subjects. Now, the mounds, as I said, also point back to the pre-Christian times. And in fact, it used to be believed that under the mounds were buried the ancient Norse gods, the famous Norse gods of Thor, named Thor, Odin, and Frey. But in the 12th century, there's a historian, an Icelandic historian who came to Sweden called Snorre Sturluson, who claimed that in fact under one of the mounds was a king named Egils, who was buried there, a king of the 6th century. And of course it was never proven that there was such a man there, but in recent decades a body was found there. And it was a body, in fact, that dated back to the 6th century, and there were even luxurious objects around the body. So it could be, in fact, that historian was right. We still have not been able to identify the body, but it's possible that it could be Egils. Well, the reason I talk about Egils is because he is a perfect figure for us to understand the transition from paganism to Christianity that Sweden has known. In fact, Egils appears in two famous ancient texts. The first one we're going to talk about is the Ynglinga saga, written by Sturluson himself, that historian I talked about. And there we read a description of Egils which is rather dark. He is a king, a pagan king that lords very heavily upon his subjects, and he also goes on expeditions outside of Sweden. He goes to Saxony, and there he plunders the house of the king that is absent, and he also takes his wives and also his subjects, he makes them slaves, he plunders the house, and he destroys the land. That's the picture that we have of Egils in the Ynglinga saga. Ynglinga, by the way, simply means it's the name of the family, the first royal family of Sweden, the Yngling family. And so that's basically a history of that Yngling family that Sturluson had written. Now, the second text in which we find him is a famous Anglo-Saxon poem called Beowulf. It was written towards the end of the first millennium, probably by a Christian monk. Egils appears not as the main figure, but one of the main figures of the poem looks very much like the Egils that we find in the Ynglinga saga. Now, the context of the Beowulf poem is set in modern-day continental Denmark. And there is a banqueting feast again between the king and his subjects, and the subjects are feasting with their king until that bad figure called Grendel, the equivalent, a bit of the equivalent of what Aegeus is in the saga, enters in the scene, and he takes control over the banqueting feast, and he begins to eat the people, and he begins to lord very harshly over the people. And that lasts for a decade or so, until Beowulf, a king in Sweden, hears about what's happening there. And so he decides to go there and to risk his life to save the people from that Satan-like figure, that bad ruler who eats the people. And so Beowulf wins, and he finally becomes their king, and he becomes a sort of servant king. He serves the people. And even towards the end of his life, when he faces another enemy and his people abandon him by fear, in fact, he still wins the battle, and he forgives his people. As you may understand, that Beowulf is basically a Christ-like figure. So we have two different understandings of what it means to be a king. On the one hand, you have someone who is very harsh, who rules, who lords over the people. And on the other, we have a Christ-like figure, someone who is ready to die for the people. The first picture is in fact the picture of what pagan kings most of the time used to be. So why is it that paganism was not able to generate the idea that the king should be a servant? Well, in fact, in paganism, the pagan kings were often believed, if not to be sons of gods, to be gods themselves. And in fact, the Yngling family, of which Aegeus was from, the first king of that family was called Yngve Frey. And Frey was in fact the name of an ancient Norse god. So they were believed to be descendants of the gods. Now, not everyone was made in the image of the gods. Therefore, those who were made in the image of the gods could rule over those who were not. There was a difference in being somehow, and so they believed they had the right to mistreat the people as much as they wanted. That's the pagan concept of being a king. The Christian concept of being a king, of course, is different at the heart, because there we start from the fact that all men and women are made in the image of God. No one has the right to oppress and to lord over the people. In fact, Jesus himself gives an image of what it means to be a king in the Christian worldview. And I'm going to quote what he says from the book of Matthew. And here is what Jesus says. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So, of course, that is not to say that all kings after the arrival of Christianity in Sweden became good and became servant kings, just as Jesus told in the Gospel of Matthew to be. No, sadly, there were still kings who, even though they claimed to be Christians or they endorsed Christianity, were still quite harsh at times. But nevertheless, this idea of rulership, of a king that would lay down his life, that would serve his subjects, begins to penetrate in Sweden and began, in fact, to transform Sweden. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.